Thank you very much. I think I'm slightly delighted that you've all had a chance for a cup of tea and a biscuit. Being a fan of Dickens, watching people sort of knitting away in front of the guillotine in the last session made me slightly concerned about how it could turn out. It's also true, some of you may have read some of the work of Daniel Kahneman, an eminent American psychologist who wrote a very successful book called Thinking, Fast and Slow. And one of his stories talks about Mexican judges who in a 3-hour session of a parole board are likely to hand out tougher and less pleasant parole conditions in the final half hour of these 3-hour sessions. So now that you're won over with shortbread and tea, I thought what I'd try and do is spend about 10 minutes trying to explore both the philosophical and ideological perspective of slowness and explore some of its practical applications in a number of schools that have been working within the slow school movement. And then actually to allow for a few minutes, maybe about 5 minutes of questions. I've been given strict instructions by the organisers that they should be questions from you, and as a school teacher, obviously, I will be quite strict on throwing out any red herrings. So let's just start off with a few basics. Many of you may be aware of an Italian movement called the slow food movement. A Roman journalist called Carlo Petrini was walking through Rome in 1985, and something deep in his marrow was shocked when he saw a McDonald's by the Spanish Steps. And once he got over this sense of shock, he questioned why it was that a culture and a country which valued so much the idea of sharing a meal, the idea of indulging one's senses and social pleasures in cooking and producing food, and in breaking bread round a table, should have moved so far away from those values and beliefs. This is what Carlo says. We have lost our sense of time. We believe that we can add meaning to life by making things go faster. We have an idea that life is short and that we must go fast to fit everything in. But life is long. The problem is that we don't know how to spend our time wisely, and so we burn it. Ultimately, slow means to take the time to reflect. It means to take the time to think. With calm, you arrive everywhere. And the idea of reflection and thinking is obviously of great significance to all of us involved in the world of education. And listening to a lot of the presentations this afternoon, what has become so fundamentally clear is a lot of the discussion which goes on in early years has really significant application to secondary education and even into higher and further education. If we genuinely believe in lifelong learning, we need to make sure that the secondary world is paying attention to early years and the primary, and the conversations are going on between all areas. And in the slow school movement, one of the things that has been particularly exciting has been the openness of people to debate and discuss across not only the different contexts, and there are precious few opportunities for the state and private sector to get involved in proper conversation, but also across the different age ranges. And so we find ourselves back to these key ideas of curiosity, creativity, excitement, the joie de vivre, that should be the lot not only of the classroom teacher and the professional, but also the excitement and the enjoyment of the students. So a few of the little precepts and beliefs that we have in slow education I think are worth just communicating. So if slow food expresses a philosophical position, that eating is more than simply taking nutrients on board, and life is more about just rushing through meals as quickly as possible. In the same way as for me as a teacher teaching English literature, the love of getting to grips with the great ideas and the great quality of expression, to be able to explore maybe some of the ideas of feminist reading and different forms of critical perspective, but also through the creative process to allow adolescents the opportunity to not only love reading, but to take that, to store the nutrients from the great works of art and see how they could maybe recreate them themselves. Creativity, as you are aware, is very rapidly being crushed out of the curriculum for those who are 11 to 18. And this is very damaging, not just for their well-being mentally, but also it has terrible ramifications on teachers. Teachers find themselves in a position where we're having to send out pre-packaged material with right answers and precious little opportunity for debate and some of the traditions of the Western liberal education. It's probably no surprise to many of you that the idea of character education has come on the radar of politicians. And one of the areas which is being explored at depth at the University of Birmingham is the idea of the virtues and the character virtues. And it's interesting that James Arthur, who's leading the Jubilee Centre up there, has returned to Aristotle. One of the most striking things about Aristotle, and I was reminded about it over and over again as I was sitting up at the back of the benches watching the talks, was that not only was he clearly a great thinker, but he was also a true curious scientist, a biologist who had a real fascination, I'm sure, as a child, for playing with sticks, getting muddy, finding himself in puddles, romping around, and through that deliberate process of deep engagement, slowly coming to a better understanding not only of himself, but also of the world he lives in. Slow food and slow schools recognize that we need to respect human and complexity. We need to understand that there is a range of personality types, that people come with all sorts of wonderful idiosyncrasies, and to hope to process them into one model is flawed and also potentially deeply damaging for their development in later life. So, complexity should be engaged with, it should be enjoyed. To take the metaphor back to cooking, we need to be aware of the fact that different cuts of meat, for example, can be cooked in different ways in order to produce their best flavors. Now, I'm not suggesting that children should be seen as pieces of meat. However, the point is that a combination of a selected approach which brings out the best in a child and in an environment will clearly lead to a more successful human being. One of the other things which is fundamentally important is that slow food and slow schooling are about making moral choices. We would like to see that what we're opening up in people's minds is something approaching a fair trade concept. Teaching and schooling and education should be one of the most fair trade of all societies' structures. And the moral choices need to be made are deeply significant. So just as it's better to have laws that protect rare varieties of produce, so it's important to protect idiosyncrasies and difference. It is better to take time to judge, to taste, to digest, and to reflect on the nature of quiet material pleasure than it is to rush through these things. And it is also better to produce and enjoy at a local, ethically sound, and environmentally sensitive level. One of the things I spend a lot of time talking to schools about and engaging in discussions with teachers and leaders is about motivation. And many of us are fully aware, and listening to people talking about the concept of flow and the idea of losing yourself in the moment, that the holy grail for many of us in our own personal spiritual lives and for many teachers is to allow our students an opportunity to engage so deeply with their learning, to feel so profoundly moved by what it is they're being asked to do or finding out for themselves, that they lose track of time. Now, that form of deep intrinsic motivation takes time in many cases to nurture once children go into the more formal educational contexts of primary and secondary. But it should remain the goal. We want to look at this in the long term. Slowness is about ensuring that young boys and young girls can maintain that sense of awe and wonder, the excitement, the curiosity, the creative spirit of inquiry. And developing intrinsic motivation takes, paradoxically, some very altruistic extrinsic motivation from the adult world, from teachers, from peer group, and maybe from elder students. And one of the things in the slow school movement we're keen to emphasize is an ethical approach to the way in which the extrinsic motivators for young people's lives need to operate. A demoralized and unhappy staff, a demoralized and unhappy education system, one which is regularly being extrinsically motivated from the central offices of government, is one that's often likely to find itself unable to show the spark, the enthusiasm, and the joie de vivre. We need to set children free. We need to set schools free. We need less in the curriculum. We need less prescription. And schools need to be allowed to have more time to work on the local level to decide what is most appropriate for its young children. One of the exciting things now working at Eton is the opportunity to engage regularly in projects with local primary schools, with local secondary schools and academies, and to see that both sides are prepared to exchange experience and be interested in one another. That one of the major proponents of slow education should be a high school in Rochdale called Matthew Moss, and there's a very powerful film about them on the Slow Education website. Shows you that the ideas and the concepts can be applied to all sorts of parts of this country and all sorts of age groups. I'd just like to finish with a couple of other ideas that come sort of at the heart of our philosophy. In a sense, one of our gurus is a retired professor of education called Maurice Holt. He used to work at the University of Colorado in Denver. But his first teaching roles in this country involved setting up new secondary state schools in the 1960s. He says, since education is essentially about equipping our children with the ability to act responsibly in a complex society, the idea of a slow school brings to mind an institution where students have time to discuss, argue, and reflect upon knowledge and ideas, and so come to understand both themselves and the culture they will inherit. And finally, from a current thinker, Guy Claxton, who's worked with Bill Lucas at the University of Winchester, is very, very much at the forefront of a lot of pedagogical practice in schools. What Guy Claxton says is this: some of the best learning is slow. And the idea that a slow learner is necessarily less intelligent than someone who always has a fast, fluent answer to every question is itself an unintelligent point of view. The word slow is one that maybe as a society we sometimes find difficult to conceive of as having much value, but it's a metaphor, and I think we live by metaphors. We believe very strongly that the concept of slow has tremendous value for all of us in the education field. If any of you, having heard this, have an interest in it, the website and the work of Joe Harrison as a consultant is very powerful. But we are also fascinated with the opportunities available for schools and individual practitioners or other consultants to come on board and to develop their own programs. So if you do have an interest in this, please do get in touch with Joe through the website. I promised a bit of time for questions. I think I've just about kept to my word. But thank you very much for listening.
It's difficult. So, questions. Do we have microphones ready to go? Hopefully. Do we have any hands up? It's very difficult to see here. Yes. Over here. Do we have a mic? No. Yes, heading towards you.
Thanks for that. I love what you said about creativity and the creative way that you delivered that. I'm really worried about this creative crushing you talk about. As parents, what can we do?
Well, structurally, we've got to hope that the government doesn't take away any more holiday time from children. I think that's quite an important aspect, because parents clearly can do a huge amount for children in holiday time and after school time to make sure that wherever possible, there are opportunities to develop some of the wonderful sort of eye-opening experiences that we've seen maybe even in some of these films. I mean, it's a very tricky time for parents. I think the sort of canon to left of them, canon to right of them, they're never quite sure who's going to have a pop at them next. But we know that innately all parents really want the best thing for their child. Sometimes quite whether they know how that can be achieved, is open to debate. I think remaining...
I get a real sense that parents could do more, but sort of after school, say your school isn't prioritising creativity in the way that perhaps your school does, and it's going much more by the book. And here today they're talking about all these wonderful things that are happening. If they're not happening in your school and you as a parent want to do it, it's quite scary thinking, right, I'm on my own doing it. So I'm just wondering if anybody, obviously I've taken a lot from what people are saying, and I'm thinking at the weekend I'm going to get out in the mud and blah, 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 that kind of thing. But it's just me kind of doing it. Is there anything that you've seen that you think could work well in terms of parent collaboration or something? I'm not seeing any of that in my school, for example.
Well, I think if schools have a significant part to play in the community and they open their doors to parents, that ends up being a very successful model. So that if parents feel slightly anxious about what it is they can do, to gather groups of parents together. I mean, one of the things actually that we do with parents at Eton is, for example, in Year 9, the parents come at the start of their time, and then about 6 months later, we gather them together again to have a chat and discussion. And of course, parents of a first child may well feel that they're fumbling their way in the dark, but they may find themselves in a room with parents who are seeing this for the 4th or 5th time. So opening up dialogue and discussion between school and parents is important. I think schools have a priority as well about sending messages home to parents about what is the right way of approaching holiday time and time off. Free time is under attack and needs to be defended pretty staunchly. Time to be bored is important time. I think parents need to make sure that they're comfortable with the idea of giving their children a large space of time in which to explore things for themselves. I think finally, one of the other things to think of very strongly is making sure that schools very strongly resist the urge to fill children's time later in the day with unnecessary homework, which I think is... Speaking personally, I have 2 children now, 14 and 9, and the number of times they come home with homework to do which they don't understand, I don't understand, and I don't think the teachers quite understood what they've set. It's deeply dispiriting, and it leaves you feeling terribly anxious. So I think homework as well is something which needs to be...
Do they still do it?
Sometimes we just say, white flag, it's not the end of the world. And it usually isn't.
I have a mic over there, and I'm afraid we're going to have to make that the last question because we're going to have to move on.
Hi, I just had a question about if you have a view on learning to read late. Learning to read slowly.
Yeah. I'm not sure if any of you were at there was an inaugural gathering in Winchester last summer. Were any of you here for that? Gather for that? It's very interesting because that question got raised, and then somebody who worked for a reading sort of support group stood up and said, well, I've done X, Y, and Z. And there was an intake of breath at one side, and I felt it was about to get rather violent. And one size fits all is something we really don't believe in the slow education movement. If you put a child off reading by trying to force them through it when they're too young, then that's a terribly bad thing to have done to a human being. And the damage it could have to them, is really almost impossible to measure. Because were they able to read and get to it in their own space and time, the next 60 years of their lives could have been spent exploring some of the greatest writers and thinkers that the world has ever produced. So you have to be very careful. And I think that the driving people too fast through things is very dangerous. But similarly, in terms of motivation, pulling them slowly through things is equally damaging. And I think you have to show balance, sensitivity, and awareness and understanding. And one of the best ways of doing that is clearly keeping the scale of schools down to a proper, appropriate level, but also not being so dogmatic and believing that there is only one way that will work. So sensitivity and balance, I think, are probably the 2 key ideas for that. Okay.